Hello, this is Abby from OllieHolly.com. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing a few of my recommendations for yarn and tools for those of you who are just starting to learn amigurumi. For a lot of beginners, shopping for yarn and crochet tools can be very intimidating. Craft stores have aisles upon aisles of different types of yarns to choose from, and ordering online can also be quite confusing if you don't know what you're looking for. Which is why I wanted to come on here to give you a quick guide for what to look for when shopping for amigurumi materials and tools. The first tool you will need when learning to make amigurumi is a crochet hook. When I was first learning how to crochet, I got a set of these aluminum hooks that are really accessible and sold pretty much everywhere. I believe each hook costs between $2 to $4 USD, and with a coupon, it's usually even cheaper. And I feel like a lot of people start out with these types of hooks because they're easy to find and they do get the job done. However, I'm not a big fan of these types of hooks, and I actually do not recommend these hooks to beginners. These types of hooks are really difficult to hold, and a lot of people, like myself, get hand cramps or wrist pain when crocheting with these. If you take a look at the bottom portion of the handle, you'll see that it's very smooth, which can make it quite slippery to hold. And with the smaller hooks, the handles are also very thin. So in order for you to keep a hold of your hook, your hands are going to have to grip harder, which can lead to hand pain over time. Personally, my favorite hooks are these Clover Amour hooks. These hooks have ergonomic, colorful rubber handles, and the hooks are aluminum with a matte finish. These are a dream to work with, but I also don't recommend these for beginners because they can be quite pricey. Each hook costs between $8 to $12 USD, depending on where you're purchasing it from. And for those of you who are just starting out and exploring different hooks, this might be too expensive of an investment right away. Instead, I recommend beginners get one of these sets that have a few different sized ergonomic hooks. When learning to make amigurumi, it's usually a little bit easier to use a slightly larger hook than what the pattern suggests. Most amigurumi patterns out there will recommend you use a smaller hook to ensure that the stitches are tight and the stuffing doesn't show through. But starting out with a smaller hook when learning to crochet makes it slightly more difficult to learn. And that's because the stitches are going to be tighter and it's more difficult to insert your hook into tighter stitches, especially when you're still learning how to hold your hook. That's why I think it's a good idea to get a set that has multiple hook sizes so that you can size up slightly to learn, then eventually size down for a cleaner looking toy once you get more comfortable with crocheting. It's also just nice to have the different hook sizes because it gives you more options, allowing you to use different weight yarns or create more than just amigurumi. Having a whole set also gives you options when you're trying to figure out what hook size works for you. So for example, when I first started making amigurumi, I was using a 3.5mm crochet hook with sport weight yarn. But as I got more comfortable, I started to use smaller hooks with the same yarn. And now when I use sport weight yarn, I use a 2.25mm crochet hook. And I also wanted to note that if I had started with a 2.25mm crochet hook as a beginner, I would have really struggled. So this basic set that I have is from WeCrochet, and I bought it years ago. When I first purchased it, it was a set of 10 hooks for 10 USD. But in recent years, they've updated this set to include 5 more hooks, and they've also raised the price. So it's not as affordable as it used to be, but I believe it is $28 for a set of 15. So if you do the math, it averages out to be about $1.87 per hook, which is similar in pricing to the aluminum hooks. You'll also find sets like these on Amazon, and they're usually really affordable. I've personally not purchased these sets before, but I do think they are nice because they come with all of the other tools that I'm going to be recommending later in this video. So if you purchase a set like this, you don't have to shop separately for the separate items. Just make sure that if you are purchasing off of Amazon to read the reviews fully before you make your purchase. The smaller hooks in these sets are usually not in the US hook sizes, so that's for both the WeCrochet and the Amazon sets. If you encounter a US size hook in a pattern, simply round up to the closest size. So for example, if a pattern recommends a US size B hook or a 2.25mm crochet hook, which doesn't usually come in one of these sets, simply size up and use the 2.5mm crochet hook. As you can see here, they are quite similar in size. Before I continue on to the next section, I do have to mention a few things that I don't love about these generic ergonomic hooks. The first thing is that the rubber that wraps around the handles of these hooks are not as soft as the Clover Amour hooks. You can also tell that there isn't as much care put into the manufacturing of these hooks. This is, however, still better than just a straight up aluminum hook. And I have found that the handles do soften up with a little bit more use, but that also brings me to the next point. The rubber softens with more usage and will eventually start to break off if you use it often and for a long time. Here I have two hooks from the WeCrochet set, and these are just the centers of the hooks. These hooks obviously used to have handles on them, but I used them daily for about a year and a half, and it got to the point where the rubber near where the hook and the handles would meet started to break. And eventually the rubber handles just broke off fully, which is how these two became naked. This is, however, a problem that I've encountered with most ergonomic hooks that have rubber handles. I've actually broken one of my 3.25mm Amour hooks just from using it so much as well. And with this one, you can actually see a bit of movement when I pull the hooks in and out. So that's just to show that even the more expensive hooks are not immune to this problem. And finally, the metal from the generic hooks are not as smooth as the hooks on the Clover Amours. So if your tension is a little tighter, or if you're using certain materials, you're going to notice that this hook catches the yarn a little bit more. These hooks are definitely not as nice as the Clover Amour hooks, but they are a great substitute that's a little bit more affordable than the Clovers. And if purchasing a whole set is not in your budget, here are a few things to look for when shopping for crochet hooks. Number 1, look for something with a comfortable handle that's easy for you to hold. Hooks with silicone or rubber handles are usually good, and most people will like them. Number 2, you'll want to find a hook that has a smooth handle, because any extra protruding bits will chafe your skin if you are crocheting for a long period of time. So I have here the Tulip Etymos, and while I really like these hooks, I hate that they have this protruding logo on the back of the hook where my pinky usually grips. So over time, it chafes the skin on my pinky and it gets a little uncomfortable. Obviously, this isn't as big of a deal if you hold your hook using the pen grip, but for those of you who prefer to hold your hook's knife grip like me, this is something to watch out for. Number 3, you'll want to make sure that the hook is smooth. If there are nicks or blemishes on the hook, it will catch your yarn and potentially shred the yarn up. If you're not able to check the hooks in person and receive a hook that has a nick in it, you can always just file it down gently with a nail file. And this final one is for those of you who have smaller hands or shorter fingers like me. You'll want to look for a hook that has a shorter distance between the thumb hold and the tip of the hook. I have 3 hooks here that are the exact same hook size, and if you line just the hook parts up against each other, they look exactly the same. But once you hold the hook where the thumb rest is, you'll notice that this one here has a little bit more distance between the thumb and the tip of the hook. And when comparing it to this one, it also is still slightly longer. So this slightly longer hook is the WeCrochet Dots hook, and it's super cute, but I never reach for it unless I can't find my other hooks. I like to have a lot of control when I'm making amigurumi, and I do that by putting my index finger near the tip of the hook. And when I do this with this hook, I'm having to extend my index finger further, which strains the back of my hands to try to make up for that distance. So that's just something to look out for if you have smaller hands. A lot of people don't consider this next item necessary, but I do think these make crocheting a little easier, which is why I always recommend them to beginners. These little unassuming clips are locking stitch markers. They are great to help you keep track of where you are in your project, and if you're making larger amigurumi toys, you can also mark your stitches in different increments to make counting a little easier. These aren't exactly necessary, but they allow me to put down my project without losing my place. And using a stitch marker saves me from having to count my rounds and stitches over and over. Alternatively, you can just use a safety pin, bobby pin, or even a scrap piece of yarn to use as a stitch marker. However, stitch markers are a little easier to work with than these items because they are smaller and they do lock in place. The next tools I think beginners should get are metal darning needles of different sizes. When shopping for tapestry or darning needles, you'll often see these thick plastic or metal needles that are sometimes advertised as yarn needles. And these are completely fine if you are using thicker yarn, but if you are using worsted weight or thinner yarn, these thicker needles are going to be tricky to sew with. With how tight the stitches are supposed to be for amigurumi, you'll have a much easier time sewing with a thinner metal needle. Clover has a really great set that includes these 3 darning needles, and I think that this set is good enough for most amigurumi projects. The large needle is good for thicker yarn and non-amigurumi projects like wearables. The medium one is great for sewing amigurumi parts together when using worsted weight or thinner yarn. And the small one is great for embroidering details onto your amigurumi or sewing smaller parts. The hook set that I mentioned from Amazon earlier also includes a few metal darning needles in various sizes, so you don't have to purchase these separately if you buy a set like that. Next, I want to talk about sewing pins. Sewing pins are a great tool to have on hand if you are doing any type of amigurumi that requires sewing. So that's anything that has ears or arms or a snout that needs to be sewn on. When I first started making amigurumi, I had no idea how to sew parts together, and I kind of just held the parts up against the toy and sewed it to the best of my abilities. It was only when I started using pins that I noticed that my toys started to look better. You can use sewing pins of any kind. I have a few here from a sewing kit that I bought years ago, and I also have a few pins from our wedding boutonnieres that are a little bit bigger, and I find that it's nice to have a variety of sizes for your pins. The smaller ones are great for tighter spots, but these thicker, stiffer ones are great for anchoring a piece down. You'll be able to find a bunch of different types of sewing pins online or in-store. To make amigurumi, you're also going to need to buy some polyester fiberfill stuffing. The most common brand in North America is Polyfill, and you'll be able to find this at most craft stores and even Walmart. And if you're a beginner, I would suggest you start with the smallest bag available. With Polyfill, a little goes a long way as it does fluff up more once you open the bag. Next, I want to talk a little bit about safety eyes. Safety eyes are not necessary for creating amigurumi, but I know a lot of patterns call for them. For beginners who want to use safety eyes, I suggest you get one of these sets that have a few different sizes instead of a big pack of the same sized eyes. Getting these sets that have a variety of eye sizes will give you more flexibility in the types of projects that you get to make. I purchased one of these sets when I first started, and from that set, I learned that I prefer 6mm and 8mm eyes. And once I used up those sizes in my first set, I purchased a big pack of the same size eyes. Just make sure that when you're shopping for these, you're getting the safety eyes that have a washer backing that snaps in like this for more security. Safety eyes are a little bit more difficult to find in person, so you'll likely have to purchase these online. And you'll be able to find different types of safety eyes. Here I have regular circle-shaped eyes, oval kawaii eyes, plain oval eyes, and these sinker eyes. These sinker eyes have been really popular lately, and I think they're a lot of fun to use. But I do not recommend beginners start with these because they can be quite difficult to snap in. These eyes are designed to sit flush to the surface of your toy and snap fully into the backing. To snap it in fully, you need to use a lot of force. And when I use these eyes, I actually have to use a special tool to snap the backing in, because the backing falls off eventually if I don't snap it in fully. And finally, let's talk about yarn. One of the most beginner-friendly types of yarn out there is called tubular yarn. This type of yarn usually has a polyester filling in the center and a machine-knitted casing that covers up that plushy center. This is the type of yarn that Woobles, the popular beginner amigurumi kits, use. Tubular yarn is great for beginners because it doesn't split, and the casing outside helps to make it a smoother crocheting experience. A lot of the times when crocheting with materials like acrylic or cotton, You'll notice that the yarn splits sometimes and a few of the strands get left behind, and it leaves you with a messy looking stitch that you then have to redo. With tubular yarn, that's not likely to happen. It's also not fuzzy, so you can see the stitches very clearly and know exactly where to insert your hook. So this piece here is chenille, and you can't see the stitches that clearly because chenille is really fuzzy. This is why tubular yarn is such a great option for beginners, because you can learn what stitches look like and have an easier crochet experience. The one I have here is from Yarnspirations, and it's the Bernat Maker yarn. Each skein weighs 250 grams and it costs $12.99 USD. So it's not super cheap, but you do get a really big skein of yarn. This yarn is very similar in terms of thickness and texture to the Woobles Easy Peasy yarn, and you actually get 40% more yarn for the same price. Yarnspirations also has a set of 10 mini skeins of the Bernat Maker yarn in a bunch of fun colors. And I think this set is really great for amigurumi because you get all these fun colors instead of one big skein of one color. For this yarn in particular, I recommend beginners try it out with a 4.5mm crochet hook. This is a good hook size to start with, but you can always go down or up a hook size to adjust to your needs. And if you're using different weight yarn, an easy way to figure out what hook size you should be using when making amigurumi is to match the thickness of your hook to the thickness of your yarn. One of the main things I don't love about this type of yarn is that it isn't the easiest to find depending on where you live. I live in Canada, and the only place I've ever seen the Bernat Maker yarn is at Walmart. But recently, I've noticed that Michaels has come out with a new line of tubular yarn, so maybe it's becoming a little bit more accessible. And for those of you who may be having a hard time finding tubular yarn locally, you'll be able to find smaller skeins of tubular yarn on AliExpress. Another yarn that is easy to practice and learn with is the Lion brand 24/7 cotton yarn. This is a mercerized cotton yarn that is weaved in a way where it almost resembles rope. And just like with the tubular yarn, it doesn't split easily and has great stitch definition, so you can see your stitches very clearly. The only thing I don't love about it for beginners is how thin it is, and it's also not the softest to the touch. Before I end this video, here are a few things to watch out for when shopping for yarn as a beginner. Number 1. Avoid darker colored yarns because you won't be able to see your stitches as clearly. Number 2. Avoid fuzzy textured yarns because they also make it harder for you to see your stitches. So I would avoid yarns like fuzzier acrylics, faux fur yarn, or chenille yarn. Number 3. Avoid loosely textured yarns like 100% cotton or certain acrylic yarns like this one. This type of yarn feels really nice and soft, but because the strands that make up the yarn are so loosely twisted, it's actually a lot easier to poke through the yarn with your hook, and this could lead to really messy looking stitches. Number 4. Avoid fragile yarn. So a lot of chenille yarns have a really fragile center strand and can break with just a pull. This makes it more difficult to do the magic circle because the yarn will snap when you try to close your magic circle. There are ways to work around this, but it can just be a little too frustrating to work with for beginners. And finally, avoid yarn that is too thin or too thick. For beginners who are just learning how to hold their hook in yarn that is too thin or too thick can be a little difficult to hold. Personally, I think anything in the medium/bulky weight categories are great for beginners. So these are all the tools and materials that I recommend for beginners, and I hope you found this video helpful. You'll also find other beginner-friendly tutorials on my channel, so feel free to go check them out. And if you like this video, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye-bye.